So we'd like to begin this session. We're already 20 minutes behind. I can see the rest of the day getting further and further behind as we go. But thank you all again for joining us, and thank you to those on Zoom. It's a little bit more technical when you have a hybrid of people here as well as on Zoom. I'd like to welcome and introduce a person that I've known all my life, literally. It's my older brother, Reverend Dr. Roland Ikuta from Lethbridge, Alberta, and his significant other, the better half, is here as well, Brenda, so welcome. And Roland has just recently completed his Kyoshi training in Berkeley, California. And I'm sure he probably mentioned some of that in his talk. But and this weekend's theme is paths. And so I had asked him to give a talk on Buddhist path, but he chose to do, I see, the Nembutsu path. So without any further ado, I'd like to ask Roland to come on up.
Thanks very much, Grant Sensei, for that introduction. I really appreciate it. If I'm going to get everybody to please join me in Gassho, and we'll start with the Nembutsu. Namanda, 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 namanda. Thank you. Is everybody comfortable? Yeah? You don't want to come closer? Grant says I don't bite, but I think I did bite him when he was about 3 years old, so not since then. I wanted to first thank the organizers, and particularly my brother, Grant Sensei, for inviting me to give this talk today. I know that the BC Federation, you've had meetings before where you've had pretty impressive speakers. I know Ken Tanaka Sensei was a speaker for you guys the last time, is that right? Last time you actually had an in-person meeting. And so, you know, that's the very top. And unfortunately, you're scraping the bottom of the barrel now with me, but that's okay. I also wanted to thank, I'm not sure who it is that chose the path as a subject or a theme, but it's a great theme. It really allows us to talk about so many different things. And I think that over this weekend, we'll actually see that. So it gave me liberty to talk about lots of different things during my talk. And I will talk about general Buddhism a little bit, talk about Jodo Shinshu a little bit in terms of the path, and try to personalize it a little bit. One other thing that you'll have to forgive me for is I do have a cough drop in my mouth. It might look kind of silly. I had COVID about 3 weeks ago, a month ago, and I still have a persisting cough from it. So if I have a cough drop in my mouth, it stops me from coughing. So excuse me for that. It might look a little bit weird, but. So I thought I would talk about a number of different things when we talk about the Nembutsu path or the path in Buddhism. First, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the Pure Land path. So what actually happened with the Pure Land teaching over the centuries. And I thought the best way to sort of cover this is to talk about the 7 great masters, the 7 patriarchs of Jodo Shinshu Buddhism. So I'm going to talk about who they were, when were they around, what their writing was, but most specifically to talk about what they contributed to the Pure Land idea. So how did they change Pure Land thought? The second thing that I was going to do is talk about Shinan Shonin. So talk about his life, our founder, spend a little bit of time talking about this, but he really revolutionized the Pure Land thinking. He really sort of put the Pure Land thinking almost on its head. And so I want to talk a little bit about how he altered the Pure Land path, what he contributed and what his major contributions were to Pure Land Buddhism in particular. And then to make it more Oh, that's okay. I thought we should talk about, well, does this path make sense for me? Right? So try to personalize it a little bit. Now, I can't ask each one of you, what is this the right path for you? So I thought I would personalize it and talk about me and talk about, well, how did I come to this path a little bit? And how does this path, Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, how does it make sense for me? And by using myself as an example, I hope that some of it would be fitting for yourselves and some thoughts that you might have about being a Jodo Shinshu Buddhist. Is that okay? Is everybody okay with that plan? Yeah, sounds good. I do want this to be interactive, so I do have some questions as we go along. I also have some prizes, chocolate bars, if you get some of the questions right. So you'll have to think carefully and see if you can come up with some of the answers. I thought I would do a quick review of Pure Land Buddhism. So Pure Land Buddhism, we call it a school or a spiritual path. But it really didn't start off that way. It was really just a branch of Mahayana Buddhism, a branch of that started around the Common Era, the beginning of the Common Era. Probably had its roots in India and then became quite prominent as Buddhism went to China. But the Pure Land School became more of a distinct school or path as it entered China and Japan. But it's definitely part of the Pure Land movement or Mahayana movement. And what's the central common theme of all Pure Land schools? Does anybody know? This is not for a prize, so anybody can shout out an answer. No? The whole idea is that we want to be born in Amida Buddha's Pure Land. So all of the schools in the Pure Land path, really one of the focuses is to be born in the Amida Buddha's Pure Land. And so there are three main sutras that we follow in terms of Jodo Shinshu Buddhists. So the three Pure Land sutras are the largest sutra, Busetsu Muryo Jukyo, Contemplation or the Meditation Sutra, the Busetsu Hamuryo Jukyo, and the Amida Sutra. In the Mahayana texts, people talk about various sutras. Anybody want to guess as to how many sutras there are in Mahayana Buddhism? Any guesses? Because we focus on the three. So some scholars have estimated that there's 265 specific sutras in Mahayana Buddhism, and about 85 of them talk about Amida as part of their content. Not all of them talk about Amida Buddha, but about 85 out of the 265 have mention of Amida Buddha. Okay. Okay, so this is the first part of my quiz. See how knowledgeable you are. So the first question is, can anybody name the 7 masters? So if you could put up your hand, because this is for a chocolate bar. Can anybody actually name all 7 masters? Oh, I'm gonna not allow the ministers and ministers' assistants to answer, because that's kind of cheating a little bit. So anybody who's not a minister's assistant, how about can someone name 2 of the 7 great masters? Oh, Zoom people. That's a good question. Rosemary does have her hand up. Unfortunately, I can't zoom the chocolate bar to her though. Oh, okay. Yes. Great. So the 2 great Indian masters, that's really well done. Oh, thank you. Oh, Grant's going to be my delivery person. Thank you. Great. So we'll talk about all 7, but Nagarajuna was the first and Vasubandhu was the second, and they were both Indian masters. They were born and went through the Buddhist path in India. So thank you for that. Appreciate that. Okay. So the second question, who decided that these were our 7 great masters? Was it Honn? Was it Shinan? Was it Nishi Honganji? Who actually made that decision that these are our 7 masters? Any guesses? Yeah. Grant Sensei made that decision. So No, does anybody want to hazard a guess as to who named them? Oh, Grant gets the chocolate, I guess. You can shout it out. Shinan, very good. Exactly. So Muddy, so it was actually Shinan Shonin that named the seven masters. And it's interesting because so naming the lineage of the teachers is considered very important in Buddhist theology. So it doesn't matter what school you belong to, having a transmission of the Dharma through various masters is really important. But every school and every different segment of Buddhism tends to name a different set of masters. For example, Honn Shonin didn't name these seven masters. He definitely talked about Shandao and Tanwan, but he had a different group of masters. So it was Xingnan Shonin that actually said, okay, these are the seven masters for him. And then subsequently it became that these seven masters were the masters for our sect of Buddhism. Okay, and now this is probably the hardest of the questions. Can anybody name one of the masters and name one of the major contributions that they made to Jodo Shinshu Buddhism or to Buddhism in general? So we talked about the two Indian masters, so maybe we'll focus on them. Can anybody name a contribution that one of those two masters made, or you could pick any of the seven masters? It's in the Seiten. That is cheating, but yes. So Shoshinya definitely talks about the seven masters and talks about their contribution. Anybody want to guess as to one of the seven masters? Maybe that means I get to keep one of the chocolate bars. Well, that's good because this will give me an opportunity to try to explain, at least from my point of view, what I think that they contributed to Jodo Shinshu Buddhism. So is that okay? So I won't give a chocolate bar for that, unless anybody wants to read quickly from the Seiten. No? Okay. So is that about Nagarajuna? Sorry, I was having trouble hearing you, but maybe we'll go on. And so people can look at the Seiten and look at some of the comments that they made about the various masters. So this up here is a picture of the scroll at the Buddhist temple of Southern Alberta. And you guys have a similar scroll. It's quite amazing because I've looked at quite a few scrolls of the seven masters and they're quite stylized and each one's very unique. So this is ours at the BTSA. And so the top two are the two Indian masters. And they look almost identical when you look closely at the images. So the only difference is the color of the frocks that they're wearing, but the face and everything else looks the same. So I had to actually look at the symbols to figure out which one was which. So the person on, I guess if you're looking at it, the right side of this screen is Nagarajuna, and the person on the left is Vasubandhu. Then the person right below them is the first of the Chinese masters, Tanwan. And then the other two Chinese masters on the right is Shandao or Zendo, and on the left is Taocho. And then the two Japanese masters are at the bottom. So Genshin on the left and Honn on the right. Okay. It's interesting that the Japanese masters are actually quite different, as opposed to if you look at the depiction, particularly of the Indian masters, they look almost identical, right? Even though they were 400 years apart in terms of when they were alive. So I thought I would go through the masters fairly quickly and talk about sort of when they were alive, what their major writings was, but particularly about what they contributed to Pure Land thought. So the first of the masters is Nagarajuna. So we have two names for all of these masters, or at least for the Indian and Chinese masters. we have their real, in this case, Indian name, and then we have the Japanese translation of their name. So this is Nagarajuna or Ryuju. He was around the 2nd century Common Era. And the interesting thing is that Shakyamuni Buddha, the historical Buddha, actually talks about him in some of his sutras and writings. He said there's this guy, Nagarajuna, who's going to come around about 500 years after I die. And so he actually foretold his coming, which is really interesting. He's the only of this one of the 7 masters that Shakyamuni, the historical Buddha, mentions or talks about. His major writing is the Discourse on the 10 Stages. And the 10 stages usually means the 10 bodhisattva stages. So one of his writings was on what happens through the bodhisattva path. And it's called Juju Bibasharon. So he contributed many, many different things to Buddhism in general. For example, he was the one that talked about sunyata or emptiness for general Buddhists. But for Jodo Shinshu Buddha, Shinan said that the most important teaching that he contributed to Pure Land thought was the idea of the easy path versus the difficult path. So the easy path is a path of relying on the vow of Amida Buddha, and he equated it to traveling on a ship. So making a long journey, but you get to ride on the ship across the ocean. So it doesn't take a lot of effort, the easy path. And he contrasted this to the difficult path, the hard path. And he said that this was a path akin to traveling across a continent, going through deserts and across mountains, so on feet. So that's considered this difficult path. And that path is a path of self-power. So you try to achieve enlightenment by your own efforts, by your own power. And then the interesting thing about Nagarajuna is there's actually a connection to Harry Potter, at least the derivation of his name. And the interesting thing is Nagara actually means serpent, okay, or the king of serpents, or the master of serpents, Nagarajuna. And the legend goes that Nagarajuna was able to transform himself into a serpent or a dragon. He was able to actually go into the ocean, into an underground cave, and to find undiscovered sutras. So he's credited with discovering 2 different sutras that were not known. And so the connection to Harry Potter is, how many people know the Harry Potter, the snake in Harry Potter, Nagini, right? People, I don't know if there's Harry Potter fans in the audience, but so the derivation of Nagara is the male version of serpent, and Nagini is the female version of serpent. And so Nagini, Nagini in Harry Potter was actually derived from a Sanskrit term for serpent or snake. So that's the loose connection. And that's a picture, a stylized picture of Nagarajuna. So again, he was around the 1st or 2nd century Common Era. The second of the masters is Vasubandhu, or Tenshin in the Japanese version. So he was around 4th century Common Era. He was originally a Theravadan Buddhist, but his brother Asanga, who's another very important historical figure in Buddhism, converted him to Mahayana Buddhism. And with Asanga, him and Vasubandhu formed the Yogacara school of Buddhism that still exists today. His major writing was something called Jodoron, or the Treatise on the Pure Land. He wrote numerous volumes and numerous writings, but for Jodo Shinshu Buddhists, Jodoron is considered his major writing. So he talked about 5 different ways of becoming enlightened or entering the Pure Land. So he talked about the fact that you could worship Amida, you could praise Amida in order to be born into the Pure Land. You could meditate on the Pure Land. That was another way, or meditate on Amida or various Buddhas. And then the last way was to transmit merit to other beings. So if you did a good deed and you developed good karma, you could transfer that karma or good benefits to other beings. And that was another way that you could get into the Pure Land. And his major contribution to Pure Land Buddhism was the idea that if you have a mind that is single, the mind should rely solely on Amida Buddha's vow. So he was really the first person to talk about the beginnings of Shinjin, or the entrusting heart and mind. And he also emphasized the Bodhisattva path. So the Bodhisattva path was known, but he really placed an emphasis on the fact that we're born into the Pure Land, that we attain enlightenment in the Pure Land, but then we come back to this world to help all the other sentient beings who are struggling with suffering in this world. So he was really the first person to really emphasize this Bodhisattva path. And again, that's a stylized picture of the Bodhisattva Vasubandhu. The first of the Chinese master is Tanluan, or Donnan. He was around 476 to 542. Now the dates become a little bit more precise in terms of where they were around. He was studying many of the sutras, and he thought, I should turn to Taoism or Taoism, because in many of the teachings in Taoism, they had teachings that allowed people to live a long life or to become immortal. And so he thought, well, I'm going to study the Taoist texts to try and figure out how I can live a long time so that I can study all of the Buddhist sutras that are around, because he said it would take more than a lifetime to do so. And then he encountered someone called Bodhiruchi, who's another historical figure. And Bodhiruchi gave him the Pure Land texts. And Tanluan said, oh, these are way better than the Taoist text. So he burned his Taoist text. That's the history. His major writing was something called Ojo Ronshu, or commentary on Vasubandhu's Jodoron. So he actually looked at Vasubandhu's writing and made comments on it. And he was the one in Pure Land thought that talked about tariki, so the other power being important, as opposed to jiriki, self-power. So he talked about the fact that attaining enlightenment or attaining birth in the Pure Land was not possible through the difficult path where you had to rely on your self-power, your own ability. Okay, so he was really one of the first people that talked about jiriki versus tariki. And this again is a stylized picture of him. The next of the Chinese master is Taocho, or Doshaku. He was around 562 to 645. And he was the one who actually discovered Tanluan's writing at the age of 54. So he was quite old when he converted to the Pure Land school. He invented the Nenju. So everybody has their Nenju with them. And he said the Nenju was a way to count the number of times you said the Nembutsu. So he was one of the first people, well, he was the first people to use a Nenju for counting the number of times you said Namo Amida Butsu. His major work was something called Andakushu, or the passage on birth in the Pure Land. And so to clarify the Pure Land teachings even more, he talked about the fact that the easy path was a Pure Land path, and the difficult path was the path of sages. So sages, it was virtually impossible for us to be sages that could actually master the difficult path, or a self-power path. He was also one that first talked about Mappo. Does anybody know what the term Mappo, the era of Mappo is? So there's 3 eras that the historical Buddha talked about, or timelines. The first is the right Dharma age. So that was the time when the historical Buddha was alive. So you're in the presence of a Buddha. And in that time, because you're receiving the direct teaching from the Buddha, it's relatively easy to become enlightened. If you listen to the Buddha, if you follow his path, if you spend time with him, basically, there's a potential that you could get enlightened. The second era is the semblance of the Dharma age. So this was up to about 500, some people say 1,000 years after the Buddha was born or around. And they said that the teaching's still alive and you can practice during that era, but it's extremely difficult. You have to be extremely dedicated, and very few of us are going to be able to attain enlightenment during that stage. And then the last of Dharma age, or the era of Mappo, is over 1,000 years after the Buddha was around. And they said virtually it's impossible. So you can hear the teachings, but the real teachings may or may not be around. And it's virtually impossible for us on our own merit, on our own power, to gain enlightenment or birth in the Pure Land. So that's what Taocho contributed to the Pure Land teaching. And again, that's a picture of Taocho. The next is Shandao, or Zendo. He was a last of the Chinese masters. He was around 613 AD. He was a direct disciple of Taocho. And his major work, he wrote many, many things. But for Jodo Xingqiu and what Shinan talked about is the Kangyosho, or the commentary on the meditation sutra. So remember, I talked about the three main Jodo Xingqiu sutras. He talked about the middle one. How many people know the parable about the two rivers and the white path? Yeah, so that's a very famous parable that we use in Jodo Xingqiu a lot, and he wrote that parable. He was the real first of the masters to focus on the three main sutras that I talked about as being important for the Pure Land path. So he really focused on those three main sutras. And what he did was he actually analyzed the Contemplation Sutra really carefully. So the Contemplation Sutra, I've heard it characterized as a sutra that is like a how-to-do manual, how to actually meditate to be able to be born in the Pure Land. And in it, it talks about various ways to meditate and to think about the Buddha. But in it, it has a description of various levels of people or beings, right? And so there's the highest of the high, the middle type human beings, and the lowest of the low. And in the Meditation Sutra, it talks about reciting the Nembutsu, or saying Namo Amida Butsu, as the way for the lowest of the low to be able to gain birth in the Pure Land. And so this is what Shandao pointed out, and he also pointed out that he thought he was the lowest of the low. That's a picture of Shandao. I'm going to just get through this a little bit more. So Genshin is the first of the Japanese master, and his major work was called Ojo Ronshu, a collection of the essentials of attaining birth in the Pure Land. He said that there was two kinds of Pure Land followers. So those who devote themselves exclusively to saying the Nembutsu as their practice, and those who use the Nembutsu but other practices like meditation or other ways of gaining birth in the Pure Land. And he also said that there's two kinds of Pure Lands. There's the recompense, or what I would term the real Pure Land, and there's sort of a side or transformational Pure Land. And he said those that practice other practices would gain birth in the transformation or the side Pure Land, as opposed to people who do the Nembutsu practice exclusively, they would be born in the recompense Pure Land. And that's a big picture of him. So the last of the seven masters is Xingqiu, or Honn. And of course, he's famous because he was Shinan Shonin's master or teacher, right? So he was in Japan. The interesting story that from his history is that he saw his father being murdered. And on his deathbed, after he was killed, or before he died, he told Honn not to avenge his death. So he became a Tendai monk shortly after his father was murdered at the age of 9. And his major work is something called Sanjaku Hongan Nembutsu Shu, or the passage on the selection of the Nembutsu in the original vow. So he established the Jodo Shu sect of Buddhism, Pure Land Buddhism. He was the first one that really focused on the 18th vow in the larger sutra as the main vow that is important. And he became extremely popular with the common person. And he was persecuted, as I was talking about when I talk about Shinan. And again, he was Shinnan Shonin's master. Okay, so let's switch over to Shinnan Shonin. So a quiz, again, for chocolate bars, if people want to try and answer these questions. So how old was Shinnan Shonin when he got ordained, when he became a monk officially? Anybody know the answer? Yes. 9. That's very good. Yep. So he was 9 years old. And we'll talk about the circumstances of how he became to be ordained. Yes, please. Thank you, Brad. So can anybody tell me what they think is the major innovation that Shinan brought to Pure Land School? So what did he bring to the Pure Land idea? You can mention one of several things. Anybody have? Yes. Yes, so that's very true. And so in many ways, Buddhism was a practice for monastics, living in the monasteries. And Honn probably first, but Shinnan definitely brought the teachings to the common person or the everyday person. So yeah, I'll give a chocolate bar for that. Oh, well, that's okay. Oh, he's going to pass it on anyways. And then the final question is, what was his opus magnum, the major work or writing that he wrote? What's the name of his major work? Very good, Tomoko-san. So, Kyogyo Shinsho. Oh, okay. So, does anybody know what the formal title of Kyogyo Shinsho? Because Kyogyo Shinsho is a shortened version of his major opus, but the formal title, okay, well, we'll talk about that. So Shinnan Shonin, he was born in 1173, and it was a real period of unrest in Japan, right? He was the son of Arinori Fujiwara. So they were part of the imperial court in Japan at that time, and his birth name was Matsuakamaru. There's controversy about whether his father and mother both passed away, and that's why he went and became a monk. There's some people who believe that his father actually joined him to become a monk, but most people talk about the fact that his father had died, his mother had died, and so he was taken by his uncle to the Tendai monastery. So he was ordained formally at the age of 9. And the interesting story is that he was taken to the monastery late at night. And the abbot at the time said, well, let's wait until morning before you get ordained. We'll do the ceremony in the morning. And he wrote this poem. Like a cherry blossoms are the minds that think there is a tomorrow, but who can tell there may be a tempest in the night. So at 9, he's credited as writing this poem to say that let's not wait till morning, because who knows what's going to happen overnight. There could be a tempest, and I don't know if he meant his mind could change or his path might be different, but he was really eager to get ordained at that time in the middle of the night. So he studied at Mount Hiei for 20 years, and he was what's considered a doso priest, so a middle-level priest in the Tendai monastery. And one of the things that he practice was Jogyo Zonmai Samadhi, and I'll show you a picture of that. So this is a picture of one of the Tendai monasteries in Mount Hiei. And the whole idea of this samadhi or practice was you constantly circumambulate the statue of Amida Buddha for 90 days. And the idea is you're not supposed to actually get time to sleep. So you get short breaks for going to the washroom or eating, but the idea is you have to walk 90 days reciting the Nembutsu around and around the Amida statue. And this is still practiced today in some of the Tendai monasteries in Mount Hiei. The interesting thing is that I don't know if it's physiologically possible to walk for 90 days and not sleep. And so what the people monks were allowed to do was, see the bamboo poles that are across? They were allowed to drape themselves over the bamboo poles. And I think have cat naps, basically. They were allowed to sleep for like, I don't know, 10, 20 minutes. So you weren't allowed to lie down, but you were allowed to drape yourself over the bamboo poles and have a short period of rest. Okay, and this is still practiced today in various lengths. Some people do it for 10 days, some actually do it for 90 days. So after 20 years of practicing in the Tendai monastery, he was struggling, and he felt that he could not achieve enlightenment based on his own power. So he entered a temple called Rokkakudo, which is in Kyoto, still exists today, and I'll show you a picture of that. And he went and did a meditation session. And during that meditation session on the 95th day, he had a dream. And he had a dream that he was visited by Kannon Posatsu, the Kannon Buddha. And in the dream, Kannon, there's various sort of versions of the dream, but one of the versions is that he was told that he should actually seek out Honn, who was teaching the Nembutsu teaching at the time in Kyoto. So it was through that dream that he came to feel the importance, or to seek out Honen Shonin. And it was with Honen that he accepted the Pure Land path. And in Tanninsho, it writes, I simply accept the words of my dear teacher. Just say the Nembutsu and be saved by Amida. And entrust myself in the primal vow. Besides this, there is nothing else. So he studied under Honen actually just for 6 years. So he wasn't with Honen for a long period of time before they were persecuted. So this is a picture of Rokkakudo as it exists in Japan today. It's actually quite a beautiful temple. And apparently there's quite a nice Starbucks right in front of the Rokkakudo temple. I haven't seen Rokkakudo myself, even though I've been to Kyoto many times. So the interesting thing was that the Pure Land teaching in the Jodo Shu school became extremely popular with the common person. In fact, they said that tens of thousands of people actually moved to be around Honen so that they could listen to his teachings. So it almost became a large suburb of Kyoto. But unfortunately, because it became so popular, many of the other schools of Buddhism started getting, I guess, jealous, to put it one way. They started getting angry that Honen and he was gathering so many practitioners, right? And even the government started to get threatened by the number of followers that he was gaining. And so after many attempts, Honen and his followers were persecuted. So Honen was sent away, as was Shinan Shonin, and some of his other followers. They were exiled to various parts of Japan. So they were forced to move away from Kyoto. And in fact, 2, and some historians say 4 of Honen's followers were actually executed. So they were actually killed because of the Nembutsu teaching. Okay. So it became quite controversial, but it was because of this persecution and because Shinan was exiled that he went to Ichigo province away from Kyoto. The other controversial or different thing about Shinan Shonin was he was married. So most historians believe that Shinan Shonin was married before he was exiled, but he was married to a lady by the name of Eshinin. The historians say there may have been 2 different wives. It may not have been just one, but most people believe that there was just one wife, and Eshinin. And the interesting thing about Shinan Shonin's history is that it was really clarified because in the Honganji in the 1920s, they discovered letters between his wife Eshinin and Shinan's daughter Kakushinin. So they discovered a bundle of letters, and this was some 650 years after Shinan was around in Honganji. And in these letters, Eshinin talks about Shinan's life and what happened to him and some of the controversies that occurred. And so it was really those letters that clarified or made clear exactly what happened in Shinan's life. So he was formally pardoned at the age of 40, and he left Echigo, but he didn't go back to Kyoto. He went to the Kanto area. And it was in Kanto that he really started to begin his career of propagating the Nembutsu teaching. He wrote the Kyogyo Shinsho at the age of 52. So a little bit later in his life, after he had been practicing and propagating, and then he finally returned to Kyoto at the age of 63. And the major reason he returned is he wanted to continue to write his major works. And in Kyoto, he would have access to libraries of the other great sutras. And so he really wanted to return to Kyoto to do his writing. So what are some of the innovations that Shinan Shonin brought to Pure Land Buddhism? Until Shinan Shonin, the focus of Pure Land schools was really to talk about the Nembutsu as the primary practice. That Nembutsu recitation, whether it was once or many times, that was critical to gain birth in the Pure Land. But Shinan Shonin said, yes, Nembutsu practice recitation is very important, but Shinjin, or the entrusting heart and mind, to trust Amida Buddha's primal vow, was just as important, just as critical to gaining birth in the Pure Land. Okay. The other innovation that Shinan brought to Pure Land thought was the idea that when you die, you go to the Pure Land, and when you go to the Pure Land, you immediately become enlightened in a Buddha. Up until that point, most of the Pure Land teachers said, okay, you're alive, you die, you go to the Pure Land, but you had to practice in the Pure Land for many, many years, many kalpas, in order to gain the knowledge and understanding to become a Buddha. And then in the next lifetime, after you go to the Pure Land, you will become a Buddha and become enlightened. Okay? And Shinan Shonin said, no, I disagree. That actually, you go to the Pure Land when you die, and at the moment that you enter the Pure Land, you become enlightened and you become one with Amida Buddha. He emphasized the whole idea of tariki in the 18th vow as well, from his 7 masters that he learned from. And then the other innovation was the idea that the teachings of Amida Buddha, of Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, is really for the evil person, okay? That the teaching is aimed and geared at the person who is egocentric or ignorant, and not just to the good person. So there's a famous passage in the Tanninsho that talks about even a good person can attain birth in the Pure Land, so it goes without saying that an evil person will. And that's contrary to most of the way we think, right? We think, okay, the good person, because they're good and meritorious and they have good karma, they're going to be born in the Pure Land. And the evil person, well, they might, but maybe their chances are less than the good person. But Shinan flipped that around, and he said, no, it's actually the teaching is aimed at the evil person. And one of the ways that I like people who have explained this, and this is directly in the Kyogyo Shinsho, in the collected works in the Kyogyo Shinsho, it talks about the sick child of parents. So if you have 7 kids, 7 children, right? And you love each of the children equally, right? All your children are important to you. But if one of your kids is sick, who has an illness, then you tend to focus on that child who has the sickness at that time until they get better, right? And in a similar way, Shinan Shonin said that the evil person, the egocentric person, the ignorant person, is the focus of Amida because that person is sick at the time. So these are some of the works that Shinan Shonin wrote. So the formal title of Kyogyo Shinshu is Kenjodo Shinjitsu Kyogyo Sho Mondui. That's something I had to memorize for my Kyoshi exams. But he wrote many, many writings. And in fact, the best place to look up all his writings is this book. How many people actually have a copy of this? The collected works of Shinan. Okay. There's, I think, several copies here, right, Grant? Yeah. So if you want to read any of Shinan Shoning's writings, it's actually in this book. And even things like the Tanninsho or other things are in it. So it's a great resource to have. In fact, most ministers actually directly quote from it. I won't go through his other major works. So that's just a little bit about Shinan Shonin. And I'm just going to conclude the last 5 minutes or so we're talking about the path. So we talked about the 7 masters, how they changed the Pure Land thought. And we talked about Shinan Shonin and how he revolutionized the Pure Land thought. The last part, I thought I'd talk about a little bit more personally and talk about, well, how do I know that the Jodo Shinshu path is the right path for me? So this is a personal question. And I think each person in this audience is going to have to figure out or has figured out whether this Jodo Shinshu path is the right path for you. How many people have thought about it? That, am I actually on the right path? Is this the right path for me? Okay. And so I'm going to talk about it from a personal perspective, and maybe some of it might apply to you. I'm just about done, Grant. So this will only take 5 minutes. Is that okay? Okay. So again, as I said, I think that this is a very important question for each of us to answer for ourselves. But for me, these are some of the things that came up as I was thinking, well, how did I get to this path? Was this the right path for me? So the first thing for me is the fact that my family history is very much steeped in the Jodo Shinshu teachings, right? So both my grandfathers were ministers, my brother's a minister, my father was a minister. We, I guess, come from temple families, both sides of the family in Japan. And so from the time I was small, I had exposure to Jodo Shinshu Buddhism. And that's not a small, inconsequential fact, right? The fact that I was exposed to it from a very young age, basically all my life, would be a significant factor in me following the Nembutsu. The interesting thing is that probably wasn't very serious about it until about 8 years ago, maybe 7 years ago. So I would attend church, I would help out on the board, I would, do the chamen supper dinners, clean up the temple, do all that kind of stuff. But really, I wasn't that interested in the Jodo Shinshu teachings. That reading about the doctrine, reading about Shinan Shonin, it was kind of fun to listen to the story of the Buddha's life and all that, but I wasn't really, I would say, on a spiritual path of wanting to study or learn about Jodo Shinshu Buddhism. So I think later we're going to talk a little bit about our own past, but the other thing about Jodo Shinshu teaching is it's a really flexible teaching, that we don't really have dogma. We don't say this is right and this is wrong. And I think that really suits my sensibility as a person. And the other thing is that it talks about things that is consistent with my worldview of things. It talks about impermanence. It talks about interdependence, right? So that nothing remains the way it is. And so it's very consistent with the way that science views the world and my worldview of what's going on in the world. So it's a flexible teaching that fits with my current understanding of the world. The other thing about Jodo Shinshu Buddhism for me is that Jodo Shinshu does focus a lot on self-reflection, right? On thinking about yourself. Are you an egotistical, ignorant being or not? And I think that self-reflection is also something that's very important for me. That thinking about what effect I'm having on the world, who I am as a person, and thinking about, my faults, but also my good qualities is something that is very important for me. And I think that's really emphasized in Jodo Shinshu teaching a lot. And then another factor that's not insignificant is role models. So how many people have had someone, an elder, an uncle, grandparent, or other members of the Sangha that you think, wow, that person's really pretty amazing. And I've had quite a few people who are like that. I've encountered them in other areas, not just in Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, but people I've encountered in Jodo Shinshu Buddhism have been humble, like extremely humble, very honest, and very kind people. And I do believe that it's the Jodo Shinshu teachings, the fact that they're following these teachings, that partly allows them to be like this. And so having these role models really makes me, made me think, gee, is this a practice or a path that's worth pursuing? Because if they can be like that, maybe there's a little bit of hope for me. And then the final thing, and this happened about 8 years ago, is learning about Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, about Shinnan's teaching, was really interesting to me. And it might be partly because I was exposed to it when I was younger, but I found that when I was going through the correspondence course, how many people have taken the correspondence course here? The Jodo, yeah, so there's a few, but going through that course, I find that the content and the stories and the teachings about Shinan and his life was extremely interesting and really resonated in terms of my heart. I felt that I really, as Grant said, Grant Sensei talked about, I really felt like I was coming home to a teaching, that it was part of who I was as a person, and reading more and more about it was really fascinating and really stimulated my desire to want to continue to practice. So for me, these are some of the reasons why I feel that the Jodo Shinshu path is the right path for me. Tomorrow in my Dharma talk, I'm going to talk about personal experience I had just recently to illustrate this example of, again, why it emphasized why this path is a good path for me. So you can look forward to that tomorrow. Great. So I'm going to open things up for questions. Is that okay, Grant? So maybe we'll start with people on Zoom. Does anybody on Zoom have a question they'd like to ask? And I'll defer to some of the other senses in the room to answer some of the questions too, if that's okay. So you can unmute yourself if you have a question. No direct questions from the Zoom audience. Thanks for participating by Zoom, by the way. How about in this audience? Do people have questions or things that they want to ask? I probably don't have the answer, but I'm sure some of the other ministers do.
Thanks, Roland. Does anybody know when Shinan chose those 7 patriarchs? When in his life?
Oh, that's a really good question. It would have been after he studied with Honn, because as I said, Honn had a different set of masters. Some of them were in common, but it probably when he was in Kantor area, I would think, as he was studying the various sutras and various teachings, and probably before he wrote Kyogyo Shinsho for sure, because by the time he wrote Kyogyo Shinsho, he would have already identified the 7 masters. So it's probably sometime during his time in Kanto, I would think. But does any of the other ministers know?
Roland has a lot to do with it. And it was around that time, as you say, that 7 masters became very important in his.
So Roy Sensei said that it was because of his exposure to Honn, and that really brought up, and most of the masters Honn would describe as the great masters were in common with what Shinan said. But
Sorry. I just want to make a comment that being to India a few times, I was looking for Nagarajuna's, not the remains, but what is it? There's a
stupa?
It's not a stupa. Anyway, there's a remembrance of Nagarajuna. And it's interesting because Nagarjuna's so-called statue or the remains are in central India. That's very interesting. And so a lot of the people that I've engaged with, they don't know this or they disregarded this because their concentration is on northern part where the Buddha spent his time.
And also, I think Nagarajuna was living in northern part of India. I believe that's the case. Mhm. Any other questions that people have or comments? Yes. And
Thank you, Sensei Roland, for sharing this. Your second bullet down, a teaching that is flexible and fits with current understanding the world. You know, you look at all this history, but for you to recognize that you can use it or apply it currently in the world, can you expand upon that second bullet a bit? Unless
Sure.
it's taking away from your thunder tomorrow.
Oh, no, it's not. Thank you, Ken, for that consideration. So as some people may know, I'm a physician by training. And so I very much through university went through the whole academics of science, right? And so a teaching that it does not jive or fit with scientific understanding of the world would be a little bit difficult for me to maybe accept, Kent. I guess that's the way I would put it. And I do believe that the Buddhist teaching in general, but Jodo Shinshu in particular, actually really fits with scientific understanding of the world, right? So that nothing that science says would be contrary to what Jodo Shinshu Buddhists would think. And I think that to me is comforting, you know, so I don't have to have a complete paradigm shift. I don't have to have a complete change in my way of thinking about the world in order to be able to accept the Jodo Shinshu teaching. Does that make sense, Ken? I don't know.
It's open to say, try it, feel that if it works for you, great, but if it doesn't, you try it and things. So that freedom. And it says,
Yeah, and I would agree with that. In fact, well, it's going to be in my Dharma talk tomorrow, but Shinan definitely says that this is a practice or a teaching for me, right? And he says each of you must decide if this is the right path for you as individuals. It's the right path for me, is what Shinan Shonin said. But each of you need to listen to the teaching, listen to the Dharma, and like you said, experiment. Decide for yourself, is this the right path? Does it fit my life? And if it does, great. And I might get in trouble from Taocho for saying this. If it doesn't, then you should move on and search another path. But Shinan Shonin says, I don't know if it's the right path for you or for you or for you, but it's the right path for me. And you must discover for yourself if this is the right path. And that's great to hear, right? That's a really reassuring thing, that we must each discover our own path and feel that this is the comfortable right path for yourself.
Can I just comment?
Yeah.
As opposed to saying that it fits with current understanding of the world, can we say that the current understanding of the world has finally come around to a point where it's understandable with global warming and that we begin to see interdependence, which the Buddha talked about many centuries ago?
Yeah, that's probably a better way of viewing it, right? So the world has finally come around to a Jodo Shinshu way of thinking.
I have a comment, and it's really regarding the first bullet there. My family background gave me lots of exposure to the teachings. And most of you here are aware that my family is. And as I was growing up, it was around me all the time. And, both with my mother and father. But also, your grandfather played a big role in our family as well. And so when you're exposed to it right from birth, more or less, something seems to seep in. And like you, as I grew up, I mean, yes, I came to the temple for Sunday services and whatnot, but I'll admit that after university and getting married and you know, choosing a path of your life's work, etc., and children, not being near Steveston as well, I was in the valley or in South Surrey, that I didn't come to the temple other than for important services, family things, etc. And it's rather interesting for me that even after I retired from work, you know, I carried on doing other things. I had doing some consulting work, etc. But it wasn't until probably about 7, 8 years ago, and where perhaps it's because of the reflection and thinking about one's own life, that it started entering my mind more and more. And you know, 4 or 5 years ago, your Uncle Kuni, and I still blame him to this day, you know, asked me to do some things. And the first year, I know I rebuffed Kuni and I said, no. and finally I thought, well, I guess I will. And so with that, with these experiences, I mean, it's all been very, very positive. And regarding the pandemic as well, and I think this is rather interesting from my own personal family, in that with the pandemic and with Reverend Grant's Zoom services, and it's been rather interesting from my point of view, and I think of our own family with the passing of my brother-in-law. I'm sorry, but even with my own girls, you know, when they were young, I used to take them to the Vancouver Temple a few times because Uncle Bobby was there and Auntie Molly was there. And so during these last Zoom meetings or the last few years, I find it interesting because both my girls have been coming on to the Zoom on a fairly regular basis. And I often wondered why they are doing that. And I have my own answers to that, but one of the answers, I think, is because they get an opportunity to see their aunts and uncles, because their aunts and uncles are incredibly important for them. And one of my youngest daughter lives in Washington, D.C. temporarily right now, and but you know, she's tried to make an effort to come. And I thought, well, they don't have to come all the time, you know, even if they were to come once every few months, you know, they get a chance to see their family. So there's something else there why they're coming. And I don't really know what it is, but they are coming. And that's very, very satisfying for me, that they are coming. But getting back to, you know, the second bullet point, you know, that the flexibility and fits our world. Most of us growing up in our Western society, we have many friends who are either agnostic or who are Christian or etc. And I have a number of friends, and none of them are you know too much about Buddhism, but I've not talked directly about it, but you know, they know I'm a Buddhist. They know that I'm the president here, et cetera, and I've taken them on a few trips because we're all photographers, and so the key is photography. But they're interested enough to know to sometimes ask questions, or we went to Cumberland to the gravesite there, and they thought it was really interesting. We've been going to the June, what is it, Reverend Grant, on Mount for all of BC, the lower land, where you've been there, the Queen Elizabeth Park, so they have come on these little trips with me, and I don't know what it is, but they just seem to find, and a number of them been here as well, and so I think it fits in that it's sort of that come as you are kind of a thing, and if it fits, if it doesn't really matter. And another thing that Reverend Grant mentioned, and he'll have to correct me here, but I remember once in one of his talks, and I do listen, Reverend Grant, sometimes. One of the talks you were talking about your grandfather, and as I mentioned, your grandfather, well, he gave me my Japanese name, but I remember Reverend Grant saying that he remembers your grandfather saying about being ensconced in it and learning so that it's drawn through your pores, right? And Reverend Grant could tell me, explain a little bit more. But for some reason that stuck in my mind, and to this day I think, well, breathing it in through your pores and stuff. So thank you.
Thanks for those comments, Ed. I'm going to make a comment, and maybe this is a little controversial, about the family connections you were talking about and the importance of that. And I think, yes, definitely they are. And it's never good for me to make generalizations. But I do find that in some ways, people who are born in the tradition, that family are Jodo Shinshu Buddhists, we tend to take it for granted. Is that not true? Like, I really do. And I find that the people who come to Jodo Shinshu Buddhism from, let's say, another tradition are often much more earnest about learning and studying and being aware of the teachings. I mean, we're going to talk about it in the panel discussion, but one of the things that really struck me, I became the president of the Buddhist Temple of Southern Alberta, and we would have people coming and joining our service for the first time or whatever, and they would ask questions, right? What's the Nenju? What's the wisteria? Why do you bow that way in front of the Buddha? Why do you offer incense? And all these questions. And often I couldn't come up with the answer. I would say, oh, go talk to Sensei. He would be able to tell you. But the thing that struck me is, I'm born in this tradition and I don't have the answers, which is amazing. And the amazing thing to me is a couple of my friends who are new members of Jodo Shinshu, they would have the answers. They would be able to go, oh, that's the reason why. Oh, it's from this teaching. The Nenju, it comes from, this seventh master, right? And I'm going, well, how did you know that? And it's because they're much more earnest about learning and understanding. I mean, that's a generality and generalization. And maybe that's not true of all. I mean, I'm sure there's very many people who are born in the tradition who have studied Buddha and Jodo Shinshu Buddhism to a great extent, probably much more than I have. But as a generalization, I think that tends to be true.
Dr. Alfred Bloom, some of you know from Hawaii, he has mentioned that people who were born and raised in the tradition, they look upon it like comfortable slippers. Yeah, we're comforted by it. We wear it all the time, but we really don't think about it. But we know it's comforting, right? That's how he describes it.
And my experience at the Institute of Buddhist Studies, so I've been taking classes from various teachers there, and the real people who have to me, a really grounded sense of Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, like David Matsumoto Sensei, like Harry Bridge Sensei, they weren't born in the tradition. It's amazing to me that so many of the people who are leaders in the BCA or in IBS, they actually are converts. They are people who came to Jodo Shinshu Buddhists from another tradition. And they're the ones who've really studied it and have a real deep sense of the importance of Jodo Shinshu teaching.
On that note, sorry, I'm going to cut you off. Well, we have to really go on. Our time is, well, okay, last two comments.
Why would you say that the founder of Jodo Shinshu Buddhism is Shinran, but not Honn?
Oh, that's a good question. So why is Shinan the founder? So Shinan Shonin would say he's not the founder of a new sect. Although Jodo Shinshu came from his descendants, particularly Kakushinin, his daughter, she formed the mausoleum, and it was really his descendants that are really credited with starting this new school of Jodo Shinshu, which is an offshoot or an off branch of Honen school, which is Jodo Shu. So if you go to Japan, many of the Jodo Shu temples would consider Honen as the founder of their school of Buddhism. And I guess you could think of Jodo Shinshu as an offshoot of that Jodo Shu school. But Shinan Shonin himself had said in his writings, I am not the master, I am not the founder of a organization or school.
Sorry, Roy, we're not going to, we have to go on. Okay. Mother gets the last word.
Uh-oh.
I know, I understand all what you say, but in Japan, the word's called monto monoshirazu. That means the long time member don't know any teaching. That sort of a, but they have as well myokoni, the very wonderful, though they don't scientifically, I know it's good to learn, good to realize, but you can deny all these ancestors that have the deep, deep belief in myokoni too. There were existing that kind of people too. So don't forget that.
Right. So I'm not saying that coming from a family background is worse than being converted to Buddhism. I think that it's just a little bit different path. That's
Okay,
all.
family arguments could go over
Yeah.
later on.
So Grant, can we
the-
close with Gasho? and
Yes,
Embassy?
please.
So if you could please join me in Gasho, and thank you very much for your attention and your questions. Namamida butsu, namamida butsu, namamida butsu, namanda butsu, namanda butsu.
So just some house cleaning. So now we're going to have in the classroom the Buddhist path of calligraphy with Aoki Socho. So if you want to try your hand at calligraphy, please go to the classroom. And here in the Hondo, we'll have Roy Sensei give a talk on the Buddhist path of flower arrangements, particularly with the onaijin flowers. Roy Sensei does such a beautiful job every week. He does the flowers for us here. So you have your choice, either go to the classroom to try your hand at calligraphy or learn about the flower arrangements. And Buddhist flower arrangements are quite unique, different from other schools of Buddhism, flower arrangement. Socho, is there anything you need to mention? Okay, so whoever wishes to go, please go and go to the washroom before you go to your respective rooms. Thank you. Yeah, I forgot to see. I take my brother for granted. Thank you very much, Roland Sensei, for that presentation. Thank you to the people on Zoom. Unfortunately, the other sessions will not be on Zoom. Were you able to hear okay?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Thank you so much. Enjoy your day.